25 countries have released a joint statement this afternoon calling on the Israeli government to end the war in Gaza and find a better way to deliver urgent food aid to desperate Palestinians. Among the signatories are Britain, France, Italy, Spain and the Netherlands, all of them condemning the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and a system of food delivery which they say is dangerous, fuels instability and deprives Gazans of human dignity. We are prepared to take further action, says the statement, to support an immediate ceasefire and a political pathway to security and peace. Last week, the UN said almost 900 people had been killed while trying to get food in Gaza, and almost 3/4 of them in the vicinity of these GHF sites. On Saturday, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Authority said Israeli troops had killed a further 39 people and wounded more than 100 near 2 of the aid centres that were open. The GHF spokesman, Chapin Faye, admits there is a problem, but he blames the UN.
But GHF was never meant to meet the needs of the population alone. It is not enough. That is why we have routinely, and from the beginning, pushed for the UN and others to operate alongside us in Gaza. There have been many, many false reports that the UN is not allowed to operate in Gaza, that GHF has replaced them, that 4 GHF sites have replaced 400 UN access points. That is just not true. The World Food Program themselves acknowledge there are no restrictions on the aid they can bring in. They and others have tens of thousands of pallets of aid sitting inside Gaza, rotting, just out of reach of those who need it. You don't see this on the news. The media isn't reporting it. So many who hear this think it can't be true. I understand this directly myself. It seems so implausible to me that humanitarians would let food rot when people are starving.
Well, meanwhile, the ground offensive continues with the first major ground and air attack in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza. Until now, the city has been largely spared from the intense bombardment we've seen in other parts of the Strip. Israeli tanks and armoured military vehicles entered the area early this morning, and you'll see their smoke billowing over the city as there were further airstrikes that came in. The IDF had warned people of the impending assault. Copies of this leaflet were dropped from the sky over the weekend. People were told to head south towards al-Mawasi. Thousands of people who have moved from southern Gaza are packed into that area, but of course there are very few safe options left. Many of these people have already been displaced several times. Israel does not allow the BBC and other international media into Gaza to report freely. Our Middle East correspondent Amir Nada is in Jerusalem, and I spoke to him earlier about the current aid situation in Gaza and that statement that was issued by the GHF.
I think it's important to begin with the fact that in March, Israel imposed a nearly 3-month blockade, total blockade on NGOs being able to bring in that aid into the Gaza Strip, and that ended with the establishment of the GHF, which has been delivering aid in this very, as you've said, very deadly, violent and humiliating way for Palestinians. However, a number of charities still say that they are facing essentially a blockade on their ability to bring aid into the Gaza Strip. The United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees says that it has around 6,000 trucks sitting, as you said, on the Egyptian side of the border, which would provide enough food for around 3 months for Palestinians, but they're unable to bring it in. So that's one of the reasons why UN agencies say they're unable to get aid into Palestinians. Others say, for instance, the UN Humanitarian Agency have talked about how dangerous it is and how they struggle to successfully coordinate with the Israeli military to, for instance, where there is fuel, to send tankers to go and access that fuel in those compounds. In order to do that, they need to negotiate a sort of a temporary safe route with the Israeli military because it's extremely dangerous, and they've said that they've struggled frequently to get that sort of pause of hostilities to secure a safe route in order to access that aid. And I mean, I was at that I asked a question during that GHF press conference because the GHF says that it's delivered 82 million meals since it was established at the end of May. But if you calculate that on the basis of each Palestinian receiving 3 meals a day in that period, it means that with a fair distribution of all that aid that's been delivered, that only around 500,000, or less than a quarter of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip would have actually received any of that aid. So they are massively delivering an inadequate amount of food aid to Palestinians, and it's coming in a very deadly and violent and humiliating way.
Amir Nada reporting in Jerusalem. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale gave me his analysis of this afternoon's joint statement from the 25 countries that have called on the Israeli government to end the war in Gaza.
Look, this war has been punctuated by statements like this by the international community. This one's mainly sort of a European-based group of nations, but also with Australia, Canada, Japan. So it's not entirely European. And you're clear that the language is very, very stark indeed. I think it reflects a degree of frustration amongst European governments that they've been talking about this. They've been counselling the Israelis for a long time. They've been warning of the humanitarian consequences of what's happening at the moment in Gaza for a long time, and nothing has happened. And I think that this is a reflection of that frustration. The fact that they are largely impotent. You know, they say stuff from time to time. They try and put pressure on the Americans to put more pressure on the Israelis. That hasn't worked. They try and talk directly to the Israelis. That hasn't worked. So every so often, statements like this come out. I think what's really interesting about it is it also reflects, I think, a degree of domestic political pressure that a lot of these governments are facing now because of the sheer scale of the suffering in Gaza at the moment. So it reflects that. There's a really interesting paragraph at the end of it where it says, we are prepared to take further action to support an immediate ceasefire and a political pathway to security and peace for Israelis and Palestinians in the entire region. That is a nod, that's code for recognising the state of Palestine, because that is a debate. A lot of countries have already done that. But there are some countries that have not, particularly the UK and the French, and there's an active debate about if and when and how that should happen. And that is, a lever that some of these European governments have yet to pull, and it's one that they are putting on the table and saying to the Israelis, look, if nothing changes, we might get into a place where that happens.
And that is very much a debate that's going to be ongoing this afternoon here in the UK. We've got the Prime Minister for the liaison committee, where he will be questioned about this by Emily Thornberry, who's the chair of the Foreign Select Committee, but also the Foreign Secretary in the House making a statement on this particular issue, being shoved by his own backbenchers on this issue of Palestinian statehood. Yeah,
and at the moment the British position is that they don't think now is the right time, that they want to make sure that recognising the state of Palestine is not a gesture. It's not a sort of an expression of frustration, but a tool that is used diplomatically to move a process on. And now, what that process might be and when is very much up for debate. But essentially, there has to be some kind of a ceasefire, and there has to be some kind of political process, at least envisioned. And so the recognition of a state of Palestine drives that process on. That's been the traditional argument. There's also a bit of politics. No, the Brits do not want to upset the Americans on this. But the question that the French and others are saying, well, if not now, when?
James Landale reporting. Now, until this point, Israel had largely avoided Deir al-Balah, this city in central Gaza. It is suggested on the basis of Israeli intelligence assessments that some of the hostages were being held there. So there's been quite a shift in the last 48 hours. Let's speak then to Udi Goren. He is the cousin of Tal Haimi, who was among the hostages who were killed. His family say his body still hasn't been released from Gaza. Udi, thank you very much for being with us. On what basis are they conducting this operation? Do you think there is intelligence that the hostages are not there, or do you think this is an operation designed to recover some of those hostages?
I certainly hope it's not designed to recover hostages, because As we've seen in previous operations, we cannot rescue living hostages, especially not from the tunnels. And at the end of the day, if we're thinking of getting all the hostages back, then the only way to do that is by making a deal. But I really want to refer to the previous interview you've had, and all the talks with these governments that have just issued this statement and are insinuating and are trying to pull some diplomatic pressure. People are dying. People are dying in Gaza. Hostages are dying. Israeli hostages are dying. Soldiers are dying every single day. And after 21 months, I think it's time not to insinuate and be far firmer on making sure that all the hostages come back in return of ending this war.
Why do you think these governments are pulling their punches?
I don't know why they've lagged so much. Obviously, it's a political game, but I really don't understand what's the world waiting for? There is a humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza. It has begun on October 7th by crimes against humanity committed by Hamas. It went on with Israeli civilians and soldiers being kidnapped, brutally murdered, and still held in Gaza. It went on with the disaster that is going on in Gaza, inflicting the civilians of Gaza. And for some reason, the world still hasn't decided that it's time to put an end to it. Not to insinuate, not to say maybe you should consider, but put an end, bring all the hostages back and end this war.
The simple answer may be, and James says the governments are impotent, is that they're running scared of the White House. They're all under the threat of tariffs. This is quite a firm statement. It runs the risk of a response from Donald Trump. Is that perhaps the reason they're not prepared to speak out in the way that many hope?
Who knows? At the end of the day, I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a politician. I am a cousin of a hostage, and I want to see him back home. And these large-scale diplomatic efforts, I wish I could say something intelligent, but your guess is probably far better than mine. But at the end of the day, if all of these countries pull together, and what's on the line here is not tariffs, it's not money, it's human lives, it's people suffering, it's a catastrophe on both sides of the border. Why are they still waiting? Why are they still hesitating? The fates of the Israeli hostages and the Gazan civilians is linked together. And once the war ends, it brings alleviation to both sides. And this is the only effort that everybody should drive for.
We should speak about Tal. He had a wife, he had 3 children. His wife gave birth to a 4th child when he was taken hostage and killed. You say the fate of people on both sides is entwined in this catastrophe. How are they dealing with the situation?
With great difficulty. It's hard enough for adults to deal with this lingering grief, not knowing if your loved one, they say he's dead, but there wasn't a burial. Nobody had seen him. There's no testimony that he actually died. And this prolonged period of limbo is just a disaster to your soul, let alone to kids. That one day their father left home. They now know he left home to fight terrorists and defend them, and he never came back. And nobody had seen him since. And and Ella, his wife, needs to hold the family together, attend to a toddler, and put her life back together. She hasn't had a home for over a year and a half, and and making sure that her kids suffer as little as possible from this ongoing catastrophe.
Yeah, it's an awful ongoing situation for the families there as well. Udi Gorham, cousin of Tal Haimi, who was killed when he was taken into Gaza. Thank you very much indeed for your time.